over 80,000 supporters. Our goal is to share facts and information about nuclear power, and we advocate for Australia to embrace nuclear power in a balanced energy mix. We are proudly non-partisan, and we do not have any position or affiliation with any political party and their platforms and policies. Thank you for joining us today as part of our national nuclear tour with nuclear engineer and Miss America 2023, Grace Stanke. We've been going around Australia visiting all the major cities and regional communities talking about nuclear power with thousands of Australians across the country. In particular, we've been visiting some of the regional communities identified for nuclear plants, including in Collie, Morwell, Port Augusta, and soon to be Lithgow as well. We've noticed in these communities that there is significant support for nuclear power, and that has been reflected in the attendance, the engagement, and the questions, and also the feedback that we are getting in these settings. For example, in Morwell, we had over 300 people attend, standing room only, and the reception in that room for anyone who was there was excellent. We think that the nuclear debate is a critical one for Australia to have. We are already falling behind. Australia's got the harshest anti-nuclear laws in the world. As many of you would be aware, Australia is the only top 20 economy with a ban on nuclear power. Today, our primary ask to politicians is to lift the ban on nuclear power. There is no reason why they could not go into Parliament today, listening to the science and listening to the experts, and make sure that the ban is lifted. Now, we should say that we are doing a parliamentary briefing in the room next door to us from 11 to 2 p.m. Politicians across all sides of politics were invited through the Parliamentary Friends of Nuclear Industries in early January, including the Prime Minister and the Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Chris Bowen. Ultimately, if the Prime Minister chooses not to attend today and not to listen to the experts, that is his choice. He has had notice, and if he wants to continue with his fear campaign on nuclear power, that is ultimately his choice. In addition to Grace, we've invited some of Australia's best nuclear experts here today, and you'll be able to hear from them, and they'll be able to answer questions as well, because for far too long in this nuclear debate, nuclear experts have actually not been listened to. And that's why we brought them here to Canberra, to the centre of political power, to make sure that our politicians can hear from them. Now, I'm going to briefly introduce each of the experts and also give a bit more of a bio on Grace. I will then get out of the way, you'll then hear from Grace and the other experts, and then everyone will be available for questions. So briefly on Grace, very accomplished obviously, nuclear engineer and Miss America 2023. She was named by the Wall Street Journal as the new face of nuclear energy. And in addition to that, she was on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for energy. She currently works for Constellation, which manages the largest fleet of nuclear plants in the United States. And as many of you would be aware, they currently have a deal with Microsoft to open 3 Mile Island. So Grace works as a fuels engineer for them. In addition to that, we've got Dr. Paterson, the former CEO of Australia's Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. They manage Australia's only nuclear reactor in the suburbs of Sydney. He's got a lot of experience in nuclear science, and he'll be available as well. Following that, we've got Stanke. Stanke, like Grace, is from the United States, has a background in advanced nuclear and small modular reactors. She'll also be available. We've also got Tony Irwin. Tony Irwin was involved in the nuclear inquiry process. He has commissioned 8 nuclear reactors in the UK for British Energy, and he's operated Australia's only nuclear reactor, Opal, in the suburbs of Sydney. We've also, I'm hoping I'm not forgetting anyone, we've got lots of experts here. We've also got Robert Bar AM. Robert's got a background in electricity. He's the Managing Director, is that your correct title, Robert? Yes. At Electric Power Consulting, and he has a big background working with high energy users and a lot of interest in distribution as well. Thinks nuclear could work with that. And finally, but last but not least, we've got Kirsty Braybon from South Australia. She manages the nuclear law program at Adelaide University. Obviously, is now doing a lot of work in terms of AUKUS, but in addition to that, she was the inaugural head of legal for Australia's Nuclear Waste Agency, if I've said that correctly. So with all of that said, I'll pass on to Grace and then the other experts, and we'll be able to answer the questions at the end of the press conference. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Will. It has been such a wonderful past week here in Australia. Australia, I've been able to see and meet so many different Australians, and the most important thing that I've noticed is that there's such a crave for knowledge. There's genuine curiosity and genuine questions that are coming from people, asking literally anything and everything under the sun about how can nuclear power be a part of Australia's energy grid. The one thing that was the most shocking part of this tour so far is how split it has been in terms of a political conversation. Coming from America, nuclear energy is relatively bipartisan, and I'd go so far as to say nonpartisan. And because of that, I think it's so important to make sure that here in Australia, this conversation must be discussed, not only to help build and bridge bipartisan support, but to continue educating the Australian people so they can make informed decisions. Thank you.
Next on to Dr. Adi Paterson, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Dr. Adi Paterson. I had the privilege of running ANSTO, our Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, for 10 years. My job on arriving at ANSTO was to really put the Opal reactor to work. It had been well built and it had finished its commissioning phase, but we really wanted it to do the nuclear medicine work, to get the nuclear medicine out, and we brought in new nuclear medicines that had not been in Australia that are currently made in the Opal reactor. We also built up the ability to make it a source of revenue by bringing silicon to be irradiated, sent back to Canada to make the microelectronics that keep our airplanes in the sky. So Opal is literally keeping us in the air by the work that it does by irradiating these silicon ingots, and much more. What we found was that there was an appetite for nuclear medicine to be expanded. By the end of my time at ANSTO, we had moved the nuclear medicine business from being a cost to government to being a net revenue producer for ANSTO, which reduced the pressure on getting new funds from government. But nuclear energy in Australia is banned. I come from a country of bans called South Africa, and the toxic nature of bans is that they stop the conversation because people focus on the ban and the bad news. The flourishing democracy in South Africa has had some problems, but nothing compared to the problems we would have had if we didn't deal with the bans of apartheid. The ban on nuclear power is an intellectual roadblock in the political discussion in this country. It is paralyzing a rational, fact-based debate. Lifting a ban doesn't mean to say that nuclear power will happen, but it will open all of our minds. Lifting the ban is such a priority. My passion is not to have nuclear power. If we need nuclear power, the economy will tell us it. It is to overcome Canberra's obsession with blocking the road with an ancient apartheid paradigm. Energy apartheid must end in Australia.
Okay. Lenka?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lenka Kolar, and I'm the co-founder of Helixos, which is a consulting company in Australia, and we are the only company in Australia that's solely dedicated to commercializing advanced nuclear technologies. And through our international projects, we would like to bring that expertise into Australia. Now, Grace mentioned that the US has incredible bipartisan support for nuclear energy, but that wasn't always the case. When I started my career in nuclear engineering, the topic was very polarizing, much like it is in Australia today. And I would have never thought back then that we would have the incredible support and drive in the US that we do today to commercialize advanced nuclear technologies and build the technologies that already exist. So I think that is possible in Australia as well. And in the US, we have put incredible investment into R&D, tax incentives, and regulatory reform. And Australia can benefit from that work that other countries like the US have already done. But if we don't prepare now, we may fall behind in the queue to get these advanced nuclear technologies. And these are things like small modular reactors that could be sited at existing coal plants and even load follow with renewables or provide industrial heat, an incredibly hard to decarbonize part of the industrial sector. So we have this chance to change an outdated policy in order to give ourselves, Australians, the opportunity to be able to prepare for and explore the potential of nuclear energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenka. I think you're followed by Tony.
In place to stop it. Thank you.
Questions?
Can I ask a Grace question?
Hi.
Grace, your company's just taken over 3 Mile Island, obviously to
Yeah, so first of all, Constellation has always owned 3 Mile Island. They didn't just take it over. The biggest thing to talk about here is there's 2 separate units at that power plant, right? So the Unit 2 in 1979 that had the partial meltdown, it's important to talk about how the safety responses worked. It prevented deaths. It prevented any major impacts. There was a radiation release to the community, however, it was under the limit set in place by our regulatory body. So I think that's really important to address in terms of that. However, the unit that is reopening continued operating until 2019, and it was one of the best performing reactors in America. Meaning, yes, people went to work next to Unit 2. They worked in Unit 1. Now that unit is coming back online as part of a power purchase agreement with Microsoft. It's coming back online as the Crane Clean Energy Center to help power their data centers.
Just on safety, and we've heard your group do good advocacy work pointing out the low risk taken with the number of accidents around the world from nuclear. Within that low risk, do you think that it is good, beneficial for the public during this debate to be informed of what the potential risks are, even though low, as you say, and what the human health issues could be from a nuclear plant, or do you think that the risk is low enough that you shouldn't discuss that openly?
I think you absolutely should discuss the risk. I think that should be discussed with every single energy source that we have, because there is risk associated with every single energy source that is around, right? The most important thing is that it comes from a place of knowledge. So when we're talking about risks from radiation, there are studies that have been done for exposures to high levels of radiation. We don't have specific knowledge around low levels of radiation. There's theories called hormesis, where it's actually it is a theory. I just want to emphasize that. It's a theory that a small amount of radiation can be good for you. Think about it as when you go out into the sun, you're getting exposed to radiation. You get a little bit of sun, you get a tan. Your body builds that resilience. You get a lot of sun, you get a sunburn.
So in terms of like the low risk, the potential for meltdown, what would be the risks that you outlined today that the public should know about, given we don't have the technology deployed in their energy grid?
I think the risk is honestly, at the end of the day, it's going to be that human interaction, and that exists at every single facility that's generating energy, right? There's always going to be some level of human involvement with setting up any type of facility that creates electricity for the grid.
But not every energy generator. I take your point that it is low risk in terms of accident potential, but not every energy generation source poses the risk of radiation.
But they pose risks of toxic chemicals, they pose risks of other types of waste that last forever.
Yeah. So what would be the risk of human health that we should outline from a nuclear meltdown?
Yeah, so a nuclear meltdown, as you have said multiple times, is incredibly low risk. It depends on the circumstance. In the case of 3 Mile Island, a partial meltdown, there was a low amount of radiation release. There has been no cases linked to that specific incident. In things like Fukushima, there has been 1 death associated with the radiation release, and in cases of Chernobyl, that number is higher, but that is truly a separate scenario to discuss, right? But at the end of the day, what we've done as a nuclear industry is we've taken lessons learned, we've continued to work together, we've continued to cooperate internationally, because we care about learning from each other's mistakes, not just learning from our own mistakes. We care about learning from each other's, and that is something that truly sets the nuclear industry apart, is we ask ourselves, what is worst case scenario, and are we ready for it? It's in our licensing documentation in the United States. It's in our updated final safety analysis reports. You can see preparation for loss of coolant accidents, loss of off-site power. You can prepare, it's literally prepared for planes to crash into buildings on site. So that's the level of consideration that goes into nuclear safety.
If you were advising an Australian government and they lifted the ban on nuclear energy, where would you say we should put the waste comes from nuclear?
Yeah. I had the opportunity to tour Sandy Ridge, which is a near-surface geological repository, and while this is my first time in Australia, that was the place that to me seemed very, very logical. They have low-level rad waste already being stored there. They have the stable rock formation, the no-water table, a lot of the geology that's set in place for a deep geological repository.
Just with the waste, I guess this has been an ongoing challenge in the States. You know, you guys have the
Yes.
waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico.
Yeah, that's a military-run one.
But plagued with problems of the fire, had to shut down. There's not really ever been a permanent solution for nuclear waste. So
Yeah.
what are the lessons that Australia can take forward? And do you think that if we do go down that path, waste disposal will have to be embedded in environmental legislation as opposed to thought of after the fact?
The lessons learned is that government should be working with their Australian people and working with the industry that is manufacturing in a way that's running these nuclear power plants, right? There has to be cooperation. What happened in America and the reason why it is such a political issue is because the Department of Energy said we're responsible for the spent nuclear fuel, and then it got caught up in politics, that got caught up in red tape, and there hasn't been a good resolution in American politics yet. So the most important thing in terms of lessons learned is to work with the Australian people, work with the industry, and actually listen to them. Yes.
Do you think that the nuclear debate in Australia would be incredibly easy if they had flagged it earlier, so in terms of partially because some of the concerns people have about it from 2050 to net zero is not that far away, and nuclear reactors take
I think it would have been easier because people went, oh.
People here couldn't hear the question. Could you
Oh,
just repeat the
yeah,
substance of the
okay. So that question was, if nuclear had been brought up 10, 20 years ago, would it be an easier debate? I think it would have been easier from the context of people wouldn't have been citing The Simpsons as a source. I have been interacting with people that are saying, hey, I learned this from The Simpsons, right? So we've got a different base level of knowledge that it would have given the opportunity to educate people at an earlier time.
Australia was quite close to getting our own nuclear power plant, close-ish, in the 70s, and
Yes.
that got caught up in politics. Do you think that there's no, like, even if we do get rid of the ban, if we get in that process again, do you see that we could actually get through the hurdle of 3-year terms, politicians changing hands,
Yeah.
and mining? Like, how do you genuinely see that?
Yeah. I think it's up to the public will. You know, America, we've got similar things of politicians and offices always changing hands and changing sides, right? And we've seen power plants go from start to finish. Recently, we had Vogtle 3 and 4, AP1000s. Now, that did come with challenges as a result of those changes, but they worked through it because it was up to the public will of the people.
And that first one that we did introduce in the 70s was on the coast in what is close to an indigenous land council who has ownership of that area. And the history in Australia of First Nations peoples being locations for waste, that kind of cultural jump is more than just the safety concerns of the actual plan. If anyone has any reaction to that, what's the, from your talks, people, what
Yeah. Do you want to go for it?
Yeah.
All right, go for it, Adi. Yeah.
I think it's crucial that in any policy setting in Australia, we build it with our current and forward-looking sensibility in relation to First Nations and the broader debates that are going on around that. In fact, I think we've seen that in places like Ansto, where we work very, very hard with the local Indigenous community to come to an agreement. There's a deep positive synergy at Ansto and the local Indigenous community, to the extent that all of the places of traditional knowledge holding and all of the places that are associated in any way with the local knowledge that the Indigenous knowledge holders have been identified and in a partnership are now being studied to articulate the Indigenous history in a positive way. I think Ansto is a unique example in Australia of technology that is a global technology which happens to have landed at Lucas Heights at a particular point, where that was rediscussed and reformulated and re-energized with a deep understanding of the long-term history. In fact, today, using the tools and techniques that are available at Ansto to really understand the history of the art of the local people, of the foods they ate, there is a whole texture of knowledge, and I recommend people visit Ansto and meet with the local Indigenous knowledge holders, and the texture of engagement and the depth of that relationship. So in the Indigenous knowledge engagement in Australia, it starts off at a basic level. Ansto went straight to the second level, the Innovate level, when that was evaluated independently by government. I think it's crucial that we have this debate, but I can assure you that everybody involved in nuclear in Australia is absolutely engaged in a deep understanding of the full depth of the history of our nation.
How critical then is bipartisanship on this issue?
Bipartisanship is obvious, but bipartisanship needs knowledge. Bans are bans on knowledge. because you can't have the conversation with the experts because they will not reveal themselves to people who are not listening. Bans say we do not want to listen. Lift the bans, the conversation will begin, it'll be bipartisan.
I think I'll jump in as well. You may want to jump in on this as well with bipartisanship. So speaking of bipartisanship, you know, comparing when I first got into the nuclear energy industry and started my nuclear engineering degree 5-6 years ago, it was a relatively split subject in America, right? It seemed to have a separate split right down the political aisle. Versus nowadays, in early 2024, we saw the ADVANCE Act passed with a nearly unanimous vote. That's incredible for our Congress to come to anything above a majority, right? Let alone something near unanimous. And that's so important because it shows that there is a focus on preserving the existing fleet, restructuring our regulatory committee so we're expanding for and getting ready for new growth and new nuclear, in addition to structuring America in general for new builds.
I know you're not an expert in Australian energy policy, but do you think that net zero by 2050 is possible without nuclear?
Well, I think that's up to the Australian experts here, right? But at the end of the day, I don't think it's possible without nuclear because nuclear provides that baseload source of power.
Rose, you were recently in Gippsland for a speaking to people.
Gippsland.
Gippsland in Victoria.
Oh,
Latrobe Valley.
okay,
Morwell.
Latrobe Valley.
Morwell.
Okay, I was like,
Yeah.
I've got some of the categories. Yeah, okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
You speak in terms of the community. Can you detail what their reaction was like to sort of the tour that you were doing and maybe some of the concerns that they had and I guess how you maybe allayed their concerns?
Yeah, they were very, very actually amazed, right? They're looking at jobs, they're looking at everything that goes into nuclear.
And I'll just briefly add as well, I said this at the start, but we had standing room only in Morwell, contrary to suggestions made by the Herald Sun the night before when they reported it was a PR stunt, but we had a really good reception in the room. We thought it was a really successful event, and the people coming up to us at the end and the level of engagement and the questions that were actually asked of the panel, we thought were, showed a huge extent of support in that community.
And you said you had a briefing slated on for later today. Will you detail how many sort of attendees you're expecting and whether you have follow-up meetings with ministers?
Yeah.
Give the coalition?
Look, I'd have to defer that to the bipartisan Parliamentary Friends of Nuclear Industries. The invitations went through the Parliamentary Friends, so it will actually just be to S1, I'm pretty sure, the room next to us, and I guess it's for the media to see who attends. We've certainly invited every single politician in this place. We would hope that politicians from all sides of politics want to actually engage with facts and the experts on nuclear power, and we've certainly also extended private invitations to the leaders of all the major parties. We would hope that the Prime Minister takes the time to at least listen to some of the experts that we've got in Parliament House today, as well as the Energy Minister. But if I'm correct, I don't think we've heard from them thus far, and that's incredibly disappointing because currently they've been engaging in a fear campaign. I think everyone would be aware of some of the stuff which has been circulated by our politicians, which I'm sure, I don't need to speak for these experts, but I'm sure all of them would be pretty disappointed by the nature of the discourse at the moment from our politicians, whether it's the fear-mongering on earthquakes or safety, all of these different concerns. So we would hope that they entertain the fact that there are experts here to meet with to discuss their concerns. We appreciate the fact that not everyone is going to have the same views on nuclear power, but at very least they should be open to a conversation and open to lifting the ban on nuclear power.
Bryce, just on the political divides, the press release for your tour mentioned the kind of gender divide in support for nuclear. Do you have a view about that? Is that something that you've noticed in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I guess somewhat, but I think that that's also just a more of a bigger societal issue. It's not just nuclear, it's not just energy, right? We've got to make sure that women feel like that they can have their voices heard in places that they feel that are important issues.
Just another point. I imagine this is a non-partisan issue and that this is just brought up by itself, but we are at a weird junction where we don't quite have small modular reactors yet. And of course, the coalition announced their nuclear policy. So why now, considering all of you experts had been in the field for many years, why 2025, the year of an election, is this being brought up?
Do you want me to briefly answer? So I think the fact that is really clear is that all of these guys, you look at the number of years of experience, it would be decades and decades and decades between them. I started Nuclear for Australia in 2023, so 2 years ago before this was actually being discussed. It was because in year 10, I learnt what nuclear power was, I learnt that it was banned, and like most young people you'll ever speak to, When they hear something that makes them angry, usually they go onto social media, start posting about it. And that was really what I ended up doing. I then had the opportunity to come to Canberra to speak in front of our politicians, actually in that room over there, and that obviously got quite a bit of media attention. It was then that I met Dick Smith. He's our patron, one of our original supporters, and indeed he supported this tour taking place. So really, and since then, we have grown to have over 80,000 supporters. We've grown to the point where we now have this expert group around us. We're able to hold these events in regional communities, talking to communities. I think we've already held 8, if I'm correct, in regional communities, and there is no other group which is doing the same thing that we are at the moment. So, look, is by coincidence? I'm sure you wouldn't expect me as a toddler or whatever to, be posting on social media and start all of this up, but it was 2 years ago when I started this, and obviously nuclear has since really been brought up. The coalition have, announced their policy. AUKUS was actually announced after I actually started Nuclear for Australia. So it's been a huge journey since then, but certainly it's a critical debate that's being had right now, and we think it's a really important time for Australians to be hearing about nuclear power. The one thing I would add is you'd probably be wondering, why is Grace here in February? This is a matter for her employer, Constellation. She's a very, very busy individual, got a lot of people who want to speak to her in the US, and we were only able to find this lot of time to be able to bring her to Australia. We found out in early December, and then we started making arrangements to make the tour all possible.
Well, I can add to that.
Yeah.
As well, is that I moved here 5 years ago, and since then the conversation around nuclear energy has been steadily increasing, and even back then there were parliamentary inquiries into the issue already. So I think there has been substantial discussion already, and this debate isn't just happening in Australia, but many other countries around the world are facing energy security issues and the need to reduce their emissions. And so nuclear power has really come back on the table, and other countries are also changing their policies to either re-embrace nuclear energy or introduce it for the first time. And to the level that at the last 2 climate change conferences, 31 countries so far have signed on to triple nuclear capacity by 2050.
All good?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Perfect. We've now got our